Once upon a time, Britain was ruled by a brave and wise king named Uther Pendragon. Under Uther's wise leadership, Britain was peaceful and prosperous, and her citizens happy and protected. But the king was troubled. He was childless. He had no son to inherit the throne after he was gone, nor a daughter to gladden his heart. Moreover, the king was desperately in love with Igraine, the Duke of Tintagel's wife. Desperate for Igraine, the king invited all the nobles in the land to attend a great feast at his castle. Igraine and her husband, the Duke, attended, but Uther was ruthless in his pursuit of her. Seeing this, the Duke became enraged, and he took his wife back to their castle at Tintagel without notice. This was unheard of. No one left a royal feast without official leave from the king. The king demanded that they return, but they refused. A great battle broke out between the king's army and the duke's. In desperation, the king turned to the wizard Merlin for help. Merlin took pity on the poor king and agreed to help him, but with a price. Any child born of the union, he said, would have to be turned over to his care. The king agreed, and Merlin wove a spell which made the king appear just like the duke. He entered Tintagel's castle disguised as the duke, and went to the duchess's chamber, where she had locked herself away. Upon seeing him, she thought him to be her husband and ran to him. They spent the night together, and shortly after it was announced that the duke had been killed in battle. Afterwards, Uther took Tintagel and married Igraine. 9 months passed, and the queen gave birth to a baby boy. The royal couple named their son Arthur. But the king had promised to turn over any children born of his union with Igraine to Merlin. Reluctantly, Uther gave their only son over to Merlin's care, and Igraine was forced to say goodbye to her child forever. Merlin assured her it was for the boy's own good, but she never forgave him. The Sword in the Stone. After baby Arthur was born, Merlin secretly took him to be raised at the castle of Sir Ector, a loyal ally of the king's. There the young prince was raised as the bastard child of Sir Ector's, and no one, not even Ector himself, knew the boy's true identity. But Ector also had a son, named Sir Kay, and because young Arthur was thought to be a bastard child, Sir Kay and his friends teased and taunted him, and his adopted parents looked down on him. The poor boy grew up in shame of his birth, never knowing of his royal lineage. Meanwhile, all was not well with the king. Just months after giving away his only son, Uther Pendragon turned ill and died shortly after. With no heir to lead the kingdom, the country fell into despair. Rival dukes and lords disputed over who was the best fit to rule England. In the midst of the turmoil, the nobles called on Merlin to find a solution. Having seen to it that baby Arthur was safe, he erected a large stone, on top of which sat an anvil, in a churchyard in Westminster, a region of London. Stuck in the anvil was a sword. An inscription on its blade read, "Whoso pulleth out this sword from this stone is right wise king born of all England." The sword was magic, Merlin explained, and only he who was fit to rule England could pull it from the stone. Nobles from far and wide came to try and pull the sword from the stone, but not even the strongest of men could accomplish the task. Eventually, the sword became forgotten, and England fell into greater ruin. As the boy Arthur grew older, Merlin introduced himself to him. Merlin and the boy would meet after he had finished his chores for Sir Ector, and the two of them became close friends. Merlin tutored the boy in many subjects, always teaching him that knowledge was greater than brute force. For, although Arthur was a small, scrawny lad, scarcely capable of lifting a sword from its sheath, Merlin saw in him the potential to be a wise and just ruler who would unite Britain and rescue her from the chaos into which she had fallen. And so, through education and experience, the wizard helped the young prince to realize his full potential, a potential of greatness, the potential to rule with justice and compassion what would become the greatest kingdom ever known. One day, when Arthur was 15, Merlin brought him before the sword in the stone. A crowd had been assembled and was waiting anxiously. Arthur's stepbrother, Sir Kay, was the first to try and pull the sword, but it would not budge. Then Arthur tried. The sword came loose. The crowd cheered, and Arthur was crowned King of England. A queen for a kingdom. After being crowned king, Arthur indeed proved that he was the greatest warrior ever alive. As king, he used his skills in fighting and leadership to drive off all hostile invaders from Britain. But his real strength was in the wisdom he had received from his instructor Merlin, who had taught him to use his wits rather than brute force to overcome his enemies. From Merlin, Arthur had learned to be a wise and just king who fought only to protect his people and never for ill deeds. The people of Britain, finally relieved of their suffering, happily welcomed him as their new king. Not even the dukes and lords quarrelled over the right to rule anymore, for Arthur had indeed brought the peace and prosperity that the kingdom had long awaited. Under his rule, laws were made with justice and mercy, and the people were treated fairly. He named his kingdom Camelot, and his coat of arms was the red dragon. But like his father before him, Arthur had no wife, no love to call his one and only. One night, a beautiful woman came to his castle and asked for shelter. She was one of the most exquisite women Arthur had ever laid eyes on, and he stayed with her that night. The next morning she was gone, and the king was all alone again. He never learned her name. In time, he learned to forget her and to move on. One night, Arthur fought a bitter battle trying to drive off some invaders, and although he emerged victoriously, his sword was broken. That night, he decided to stay and rest at a local castle. Merlin tried to dissuade him, but Arthur insisted on going. While asleep that night, Arthur was awakened by the sound of a harp echoing through the castle halls. He arose from his bed and followed the sound until he came upon a woman sitting all alone in her bedchamber. Her name was Guinevere, and she was the most beautiful woman Arthur had ever seen. Merlin warned that Guinevere would bring him nothing but misery, but Arthur was intent on marrying her. The next day, Arthur asked Guinevere's father for her hand, and he gladly agreed. The announcement was made later that day. The people of Camelot rejoiced. They were glad to see their beloved king happy and in love, and the prospect of having an heir to the throne was, indeed, cause for celebration. Everyone in the kingdom was filled with excitement and tears of joy. Everyone, that is, except for Merlin. Later that day, Merlin took Arthur out to a misty lake. On the other side of the mist, he told Arthur, was the island of Avalon. The beings who lived there possessed supernatural powers, which they used for both good and evil. All of a sudden, a beautiful woman came rising up out of the water. In her hand, she held a magnificent jeweled sword. "If you insist on surrounding yourself with such dangers," Merlin told Arthur, "then you are going to need a powerful weapon to protect yourself. This is Nimue, the Lady of the Lake. The sword is Excalibur. It is the finest strength and can cut through iron and steel. But the real magic lies in the scabbard, for whoever holds the scabbard shall never die of his wounds. Always keep it by your side. Never let yourself be parted from it." Soon after, Arthur and Guinevere married. The entire kingdom celebrated. There was much feasting and dancing at the wedding, and the people from all parts of the kingdom came to see their beloved king enter into matrimony with his one true love. As a wedding present, Guinevere's father gave the couple a round table, large enough to seat all of Arthur's knights. Over each seat was a plaque inscribed with the name of the knight for whom the seat was intended. Only one seat had no name inscribed above it. This seat was reserved for the greatest knight of all. If anyone else sat there, he would surely die. The gift of the Round Table made Arthur happy, for he had been worried that his knights were becoming too competitive amongst each other. With the Round Table, all of his knights could sit together and discuss matters of the kingdom as equals. Many years passed, and Arthur and Guinevere lived together in married bliss. The king looked at his bride with adoration and contentment, and he spared no expense in making her happy. For years they lived together happily. Then Lancelot came.